So, okay, so what we're going to be chatting about today is the why and how and demographics of inclusion, a demographics, inclusion, organizational assessment. So I'll kind of go over what the differences are between some of them, because sometimes some people are like, what are your organizational assessments, and why are we doing those, and why they're important? I'm a firm believer in them, so will tell you why. And as I mentioned, I'm calling in from Veza. Our company is actually from Vancouver, on the ancestral and ceded territories of the saber-tooth. Actually, we're not on that. We're in Langley. So I will not. I actually did not prepare my land acknowledgement properly, but I just realized we changed our addresses. So with that, the lands that we are supported by the ancestors of the lands that we live on in Vancouver. In the most beautiful thing is, like, it's sometimes even doing these land acknowledgements, because I'm like, I'm sitting in the Netherlands. I mean, I live in the Netherlands usually, but in a land where they've colonized most of the people, and where I'm trying to do these land acknowledgements, and I always and I always mess them up, to be honest, because the people of the Netherlands, and especially the ones who actually are the stewards of the land here, they don't really get recognized all the time either. And then when we start thinking about the work that we're doing and what that context is and what does that mean when we're looking at decolonization and looking at the lands, I do have to remember the lands that my family, my parents grew up on in Punjab, and how those ancestors are supporting my work wherever I am in the world. And then obviously the fact that Veza, we work on in Vancouver, in Vancouver, the Lower Mainland, and all over. And so for me, it's really important, just the ancestral energies. Like one of the biggest things I think from this work has been, for me as a reminder, is that we are always supported wherever we are. And we also have to remember where we came from and where we're going. And I think that as I mess up my land acknowledgement today because of the fact I wasn't prepared, but it's also I will do it in general, like of the lands that support the work. And thinking about the differences in demographics, inclusion, organizational assessments, we'll look at that, what to consider when you're conducting your own, when to hire a third party, a Q&A and an invite to connect further. And as you've already done the introductions, that's great. Yeah, so this is meant to be a safe space. Sometimes some things will come up here that we are sharing that we do not want other people to know. So please do keep the conversations confidential once we do take the recording off. So the differences between the surveys. So I think how familiar is everyone, if you could pop it into the chat, with the different types of surveys between demographics, inclusion, or organizational assessments? And then I'll kind of go through it. So one of the things with the demographics, and why I decided to actually do this webinar, was when CBCs, so a lot of the organizations are doing the demographics, but one of the things is people don't really talk about the privacy laws and the data protection and the confidentiality that needs to go along with it. And really thinking about who has access to the information. And when recently there was the news about CBC's information being leaked, and I don't know the whole story of what happened or why that happened, but a lot of the times when I'm talking to different organizations, because they're not considering these privacy laws and the data protection, there's no one's fault, because they actually just don't know what they don't know. And in the next, recently, because we work with a lot of government agencies and public institutions, so we have to do the personal information assessment for every organization in order to get approval to do even our surveys. And every time we do it, and it was interesting because I was talking to one of my privacy lawyer friends, because I was like, why do these things take so long? Because we don't collect personal information. So the first of all, and I'm going to just start with personal information, is anything that identifies a person that's not shareable by the organization. So that could be their IP address, that could be their email address, that could be his personal email address, anything that the individual doesn't share themselves, like name, gender, and all those things as well. But what happens is if the individual shares is not personal information anymore, and the law is different. And many of you might know that GDPR in the Europe is like the standard for privacy right now. Canada's actually changing a lot of its laws, especially BC, to match that. They're not far behind. So one of the things is like if you know GDPR, you all of a sudden will, if you actually follow those rules, you actually be more in alignment with making sure that there's protection. You're thinking about individuals' protection as well. With the higher incidence of like cybersecurity challenges that are going out, and the fact that demographics data can be harmful to some individuals, obviously, if they're not out within organizations, if they don't want people to know that they have a disability, if they don't want their managers to know, their team members to know, demographics data can impact their promotion. It could impact how teams interact with them and what their experience is within the organization. So demographic data, really, that's why, and when we're thinking about even self-identifying demographic data, many times, sometimes it's very valid, sometimes it's not. Like recently, we were working with an organization where last year they met the 50-30 challenge, which is put on by the federal government of making sure you have 50% women and 30% of individuals from various different equity deserving groups. And but this year they weren't meeting it because someone decided to not self-disclose that they're Indigenous anymore. And because it's their choice. And the person then, when they ask them, they're like, but you can't really ask them because it's actually not, it's supposed to be a self-identification. And there's actually like, it's supposed to, and you can't really go and be like, why didn't you self-identify? But somehow it came in, and they found a way to like bring it up in conversation generally and be like, we understand that you changed how you identify. Is there something that we need to know? Or is there something that we need to be aware of to support you better in the organization? And the person's like, I just don't want to be identified under that. I want to be identified as as a person rather than my label and identity, which I've been hearing a lot of. I've actually been hearing that more and more where people like, I actually know quite a few actually women of color who are like, I won't identify on any demographics data because I just want to be actually known for my expertise rather than what my identities are. And so for this person, they decided that they are not gonna, they're like, I don't want to identify as Indigenous just so that the organization can meet their 50-30 challenge. And so it was, which is their choice, right? But this where it goes back to, and also understanding how is information going to be used and why are we collecting the demographics? Why is it important? And also understanding that it can be triggering for people as well, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Inclusions surveys are to understand the experiences of individuals. It is, the importance of trying to consider it, doing the analysis by demographics, because knowing that different groups may have different experiences based on the systems and processes that are within the organization. But another thing is also what's done with the data and how is that data being used and how are we looking at those experiences? Are we actually using those experiences as a measurement and a KPI in how we move things forward within the organization? Or are we just using that we want to collect a benchmark and just have it and then develop programs from it? But the thing is, if we're actually developing programs from it, how do people know that who's going to get access to that information? How is it going to be summarized and what reporting is going to be actually done with it as well? So some, things that we want to consider. Then when we're looking at the organizational assessment, we actually understand how the organization ranks from basis of perspective of the staff members on the inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, and belonging maturity model. The maturity model starts from compliance and it ends with industry leaders, and it's about the different stages that organizations can be at, about how many resources they have put towards this work. Do they have staff members? Are they paid for their time on committees? what type of action plan and strategies are in place. So that determines your where you're on the maturity model. And what we understand with the organizational assessments is that there is a bias because it's based on what information staff members have. The organizational assessments that Veza does, we do it on inclusive culture, inclusive marketing, supplier diversity, and also inclusive product and service design or program design. People always ask us, why do you do supplier diversity? It's a constant question. My biggest thing is if people understand how people get contracts within the organization, by the organization, that's actually how we change economic empowerment of all the other equity deserving groups around us. Because it's not just about hiring, it's about who we're actually giving contracts to. We're moving to a gig economy. We know that people, different demographics are moving towards the gig economy as well. And in order for them to get hired, they need to know how to access those contracts. They need to know how to access the RFPs, any bids, any ways to bid, what that might look like. If they don't know that, then you're only focusing on internal. But a lot of your contractors and a lot of your consultants, you're not measuring that, and you could actually have very unfair, inequitable processes for any of those individuals as well. And one of the things we always hear is well, I know someone, let me hire that person, traditionally, but that's actually why we want to measure to supplier diversity. We want to decrease that level of nepotism or level of like, I know a person kind of thing. So Veza actually means nepotism in Serbian. So they always make fun of us when I go to Serbia. They're like, your organization actually perpetuates nepotism, which is not true. So depends on how you look at it. And Croatians like to say that we're connection. Serbians like to say we talk about nepotism, which is not, and I'd like to focus on the connection piece. With organizational assessment, it's again, what's the communications plan for afterwards? Why are you collecting the information? What's going to happen? Is there going to be a strategy? Is there going to be analysis? And who's going to get to see that information, and what does that look like afterwards as well? If there's any questions, please put it into the chat as well, and go so that we can, I'm happy to answer those. So what to consider when you're doing a self-assessment? I was trying to be funny today, so I was like, let's add comics in. So I hope you enjoyed the comics. The biggest thing with self-assessments, people always ask me, they're like, why wouldn't we do it ourselves? And why would we hire a third party? Because there is a possibility to do yourself. We do have a 10-question self-assessment that you can download from diversity.tapnetwork.ca. But the biggest thing is why sometimes what happens is self-assessment, I think for smaller organizations is very necessary. At least you have something. But one of the things we are finding is a lot of organizations will rank themselves higher on a self-assessment, and depending on who's doing it. And so many times, many organizations, executives are like, oh, we're doing great. So they'll just rank themselves super high on everything that they're doing. They're like, yeah, we're looking at the maturity model. We're probably at a champion stage because of this, this, and this. But the other hand, is it really like how much and who's doing that self-assessment as well? And that actually is a big thing. One of the other things that a lot of people is considering when you're doing self-assessment, I'm going to push for privacy and data protection, right? Thinking about, again, how's the data being used? Who's has access to it? What systems what technology systems are you using to house the demographics data? And who has access to that data as well? Many times people are like, oh, that like 5 people have access to our HR, like, if it's for larger organizations, or like 5 people have access to that part of the system, but do they really all need access to it? So really thinking about who actually, everyone that needs access. For even smaller companies, people are like, well, the CEO has access, but then this other person has access too. It's like, again, do both people really need the access? Really thinking about who actually is looking at that data, because it could actually influence it can influence someone's journey again. The other thing with self-assessments, really, again, knowing what your next steps are and communicating that, and when you're asking people to do it, is super, super important. One of the things that we see sometimes with self-assessments, people are like, yeah, we did a self-assessment, but we're not going to talk about it to anyone else. and they won't report out on it. They don't actually know what the next steps are. So this exercise happens, but there's no follow-up afterwards. And so really thinking about when you are doing a self-assessment is before, as you, and we're going to go on the next slide, but is really thinking about what is your plan afterwards? What is your communications plan? What is that going to be? It has to be the same, regardless if it's a third party or a self-assessment. So just something to consider. And then I also have another joke, Dilbert, of course. But this is, it was really fitting, was, you know, we don't want accurate information to bubble up to senior management. And this is why sometimes we do third party rather than self-assessments. For those of you who are just joining, we're just going to do the recording and then we'll answer questions afterwards. And so please do introduce yourself in the chat while we're just doing the presentation, and then I'm going to stop the recording so we can all have a discussion. So with the third party, it is about trust, being impartial, confidence, and it's also they won't give you what you only give you what you want to hear. And many times organizations, so there's a really interesting case that we had where the organization was provided the report, and this has happened on multiple occasions though, where they're like, you know what, we're only going to report out on some of it, we're not reporting out on everything. And then another EDI professional said to me, they're like, but your voice is being silenced. And it's like that whole ethics of what do you do as a consultant and what do you do as a professional in this space? You know, because it's like, yeah, we can provide our analysis. And as with any consultant reports, they can just be like, well, that stuff doesn't work for us, so we're not going to report that out. Whereas even though we think it's important and it's actually what their staff said. So really thinking about knowing that that's the dangers of when you're consulting in this space as well. And there's like this really fine line with ethics, which I would love to, we can have a further discussion about afterwards as well. With third parties, a lot of the times, we know that with budget cuts in a lot of organizations, actually recently, we've seen it numerous times where they had budgets for third parties to come in and do the assessments, but they've decided to go self-assessment now instead. Because the budget, they're like, we don't have the budget to do this. With the third party, it is cheaper in some ways because you're doing the analysis, you have different expertise and everything else. But there's still time that is required within the organization in order to do the assessment, because you do need to look at sending out the communications, getting engagement, making sure management's on board, making sure leadership's on board. The success of any assessment is going to be based on how successful the relationships are with internally as well, and who's championing it internally. So regardless of what we're doing, third party or self-assessment, it goes back to relationship building, and that has to start being built actually ahead of time before the assessment goes out. Thinking about communication plan considerations, always have an endorsement from leadership. That's really important because people need to know that, like, so they can answer, why are we doing it? Who's going to have the access? Who will see the report? Where will the data be housed? How will people's identities be protected if it is anonymous? Also thinking about having announcement, different emails, announcement, the one sending out the links, a reminder in the closing emails. Even thinking about the consideration, does everyone have access to emails? We think that everyone has access to email. Like we're like, oh, we're just going to send an assessment link. Many of our clients, about 5 to 10% of their staff actually don't have access to a work organizational email. And so when we're actually setting up any types of assessments or any types of programs, thinking about, does everyone have access to emails? Do they have access to a computer where they can access work information? Many of the organizations we're working with, actually, as we're talking about this, they've started to do internal posters. They've had to do with a QR codes, or give time during staff, work time, to have them do the surveys as well, because otherwise it's not allocated there. A lot of our organizations are actually, they have a special code that for billable hours that they'll put against the survey so that people will do it. So they will get paid for it. Also make sure that there's always where can they follow up and what supports are available in terms of like counseling, someone to talk to, preferably sometimes outside the organization that's trauma-informed and understands microaggressions and racism as well, because it might be very triggering when you're doing these assessments as you're thinking about your experience. It might trigger something in someone that that's important that they have the supports available as well. So we're going to do Q&A now. I know, and I'm going to just stop recording so we can have a discussion.